So I'm not sure how 2023 went for all of you, but last year was a pretty good year for me in terms of media that I liked. Not only did I check out plenty of new shows, with some of them becoming some of my all-time favorites, but the media and franchises that I were already invested in were really popping off this year. In terms of anime, One Piece had finally reached the long-awaited Year 5 transformation in the anime, resulting in some of the best animated episodes I've ever seen. Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 has been one of the best animated series of television since the first season of One Punch Man, even though MAPPA had to abuse their animators in order to do it. My favorite game franchise, Mario, has been getting a lot of new products recently, with the highlight of course being Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which has quickly become one of my favorite Mario games of all time, as well as multiple remakes of beloved past games on the horizon. But something I didn't expect to get a lot of this year was good adaptations, specifically with things that I like. The Super Mario Bros. Movie was a simple but incredibly fun nostalgia-filled ride that grossed over $1 billion worldwide, and One Piece released an incredibly competent and enjoyable live-action adaptation that, in my opinion, is one of the best live-action anime adaptations ever, though to be fair, there isn't really much competition. So it's fitting that this great year of media for me ended off with one of my favorite franchises on the planet, Percy Jackson. If you've followed this channel for even a little bit, you'll know that I'm a pretty big fan of this franchise. I'm going to spare you from a long-winded paragraph of how much the Percy Jackson franchise means to me because, with my various videos and death battle trailers made about him, I think you can probably gather that I love this character and his franchise quite a lot. And this year was a pretty big year for the franchise, one of the biggest in a very long time. Not only did we get a new book from the series back in September, but also the long-awaited Disney Plus series finally released in late December, which is the topic of today's video. Because I, like a lot of other Percy Jackson fans, were cautiously skeptical about this show. Between Disney's track record now of peddling out bad show after bad show onto their failing streaming service with no sense of quality control, to the controversial casting that has a lot of fans up in arms, it's safe to say that not everyone was fully convinced that the show would be what they had hoped, even with the author fully involved. But I'm not one to judge a show based off of trailers and a controversial cast. I'm going to give this show a proper look and review to see if this show's adaptation was worth the several years worth of waiting, or if it's just going to fall to the wayside as another IP slaughtered by Disney's greed. Starting out small, one of the first things that caught my eye about this show were the set designs, specifically Camp Half-Blood itself. A lot of the locations that are visited in this show are either real-world locations or places like Olympus and the Underworld, which are mostly CG. But Camp Half-Blood looks exactly how I pictured it when I was reading the books myself. Everything from the cabins to the dining hall to the big house, everything looks great and exactly how I would imagine it. And watching all the campers run around while Chiron's showing Percy around really helps the camp feel like a real place, and I kind of wish we got to see more of it. I also love the other small details from the books like the t-shirts, the beaded necklaces, and the offerings to the gods during the dinner scene, and the fireworks at the end. Details that literally no one else would notice or care about except for big fans like me, and I'm glad they put all of that in. Other settings like Auntie M's and Waterland all look great as well, and more or less look exactly how I would imagine them while I was reading the books. Sets made through CG like the Underworld and Olympus both look surprisingly great, considering that this is made by a company that will sink hundreds of millions of dollars into movies and still have their CGI look like it came out of Spy Kids. The Underworld definitely looks a bit grayer than I imagined it being, and his castle just being a big empty stone room is an interesting design choice, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Olympus looks amazing, the establishing shots of the entire city are great, and give a great sense of how just absolutely massive and grand this place is. In terms of the throne room itself, I think I prefer the dome that was portrayed in the original movie, since that was more of how I pictured it, and I believe it was also how it was originally described in the books, but I like the different approach and it looks cool, so I'm not complaining that much. I also like how they had the little fire pit for Hestia in the corner. That just shows attention to detail and has a nice little bit of foreshadowing in there. On the topic of the CGI, the effects and the monsters also look surprisingly great. Monsters like the Minotaur, the Furries, the Chimera, and my personal favorite, the good boy Cerberus, all look very impressive, which is again surprising considering this is a Disney Plus show we're talking about. I also like how Cerberus is a Rottweiler, the same dog breed that he was described as in the books. Once again, just another great attention to detail I wanted to bring up. Moving on from the production stuff, let's get into the writing, because that's where some of my favorite and least favorite parts of the show lie. And I want to start with the first big negative I noticed about the show, and that's that I'm not a big fan of how Gabe was portrayed here. He was funny, sure, but he didn't really give off the vibe of a cruel and abusive stepfather, which is what he was supposed to be. He's just kind of this loser bum that lives in their house instead, and doesn't really have any kind of meaningful presence. Gabe in the books was a way to highlight Percy's insecurities and doubts, as well as how much Percy's mom put ups with just to keep him safe, since through marrying Gabe, his bad smell shrouded Percy from the monsters, which is something they don't bring up in the show. I'm sure that will be addressed later, but it's something that is not addressed in the show, so it just kind of makes you wonder, like, why is she staying with him to begin with? They don't explain why he's there to begin with. So her putting up with his cruel and abusive tendencies was a way of showing us physically just how much she sacrificed for him and why Percy cares so much about her. Here we don't really get any of that. They just argue like a divorced couple in the beginning, and that's really it. He doesn't really have any kind of presence or intimidation. He's just kind of this loser that lives in their house. And it's not really the worst thing in the world, and it's far from the worst thing they could have changed, but it does kind of water down Percy's whole beginning arc and makes his insecurities feel less impactful. But, on the flip side, they do dedicate a lot of extra time to giving us flashbacks of Percy and his mom. These scenes, I think, help make up for the lack of not being able to explain everything to us through dialogue. Because when you're adapting a book into a show, during any given scene, you might be missing out on additional information that could only be explained naturally through internal monologue. And in this first scene where we meet Percy's mom in the books, he basically gives us a rundown of her and what she does and what she's done in basically 2 paragraphs, which is something you can't really do in a live action show. So giving us these additional flashbacks to expand upon their relationship, I think was a pretty smart choice. Not all of them are amazing. I think the final one with Poseidon is the one I mixed on the most, but again, it does help establish how much Percy really just cares about his mom and how much he's willing to do to bring her home safely. As to be expected, there's a lot of things about the book story that were changed for the sake of either pacing or to change things up, which is fair. Normally when it comes to adaptations, I prefer for the story to remain mostly close to the original, only making changes when absolutely necessary for pacing purposes. Netflix's One Piece is actually a great example of this. But a lot of the changes the Percy Jackson show makes ultimately don't amount to much issue or changes in the overall story. A lot of the same events from the book play out here, just slightly differently, which I'm fine with. Auntie M's, Percy falling from the arch, their encounter with Ares, the Lotus Casino running from Cerberus, the encounter with Hades, and the final fight with Ares, all of these happen both in the book and in the show, just in varied ways, which at the end of the day I'm fine with. They're ultimately meaningless changes. They don't really add anything, but they don't really take away anything either. They're just like slight different changes to the story to spice it up a bit, make it a bit different, which again I'm fine with. Though there are some changes that were made that I'm unsure about or just don't like. The first one I mixed on is Annabeth and Percy retrieving Ares' shield. In the book, it was basically a harmless side quest. They go down a water slide, Percy gains a better understanding of how to use his water powers, they get the shield back, yada yada. But the whole thing with the chair and Percy sacrificing himself to get the shield so that they can get to Hades is weird. It's a great character moment for Percy and shows his willingness to put himself in harm's way for the sake of his friends and family, which is something this show in general just does a great job of highlighting. But it's just such a big and odd change that I wondered why do it if the sacrifice was going to be undone anyway. I don't think I hate it, it's just a very odd change that I wanted to highlight, but I'm leaning towards disliking it. Hermes in the Lotus Casino were also odd. I'm not necessarily against Hermes showing up earlier than he does in the original books, and they play this take on the scene of the events pretty well. It's just another very large and very odd change that took a bit to get used to since I'm already very used to the book's chain of events. And lastly, the change they made immediately afterwards, which is that in the time that the trio was in the Lotus Casino and by the time that they're out, the deadline of the solstice has passed and Zeus and Poseidon are about to go to war. I don't like this change. If you've read even a couple of books from the Percy Jackson library, or even from other series like the Kane Chronicles, you'll probably know that deadlines are very important in this series. Basically every quest, even from other outside Rodenverse books like Kane Chronicles or Magnus Chase, have some kind of deadline that the heroes need to succeed by. That's something that remains pretty unwavering throughout the story of this universe. It gives a sense of urgency by default, so whenever there's a setback, there's that tension immediately because you don't know if they're going to make it on time or not, even if they do eventually always find a way to make things work. Because if the deadline is passed, it's over, no discussion. But here, they decided to change that, and have them pass the deadline because they were in the Lotus Casino for too long. And yet, everything still plays out the exact same anyway. Percy goes to the underworld, talks with Hades, uses the pearls, fights Ares, retrieves the Master Bolt and the Helm of Darkness, goes to Olympus, returns the bolt, yada yada rada rada. So why make that change? Why have the deadline pass if everything was going to play out the same anyway? It just kind of goes against the point of the deadline and makes it feel less important or impactful. And I really hope they don't make a habit of doing this more often. I don't think they will. I think Rick is smart enough to know is that if they continue to pass these deadlines over and over again in future seasons, it's going to lose all meaning. So I hope they know better. They probably do, but it's still a criticism that I wanted to bring up because I wasn't really a fan. In terms of recreated scenes that I did like, I thought that they handled Luke's villain reveal perfectly, and it is probably my favorite scene in the entire season. I love how the fireworks in the background dimly illuminate the scene, and how the different colors come in at different parts to elevate the intensity of it, and the acting from Charlie Bushnell as Luke was on point. I'll get to the casting more later, but I want to dedicate this to highlighting his performance here. I was originally skeptical of his casting as Luke. I thought he looked more like an adult Percy Jackson than a young Luke, and he didn't really strike me as someone who could pull off a character like Luke, but I've never been so happy to be wrong in my life. He does really well throughout the entire series, but this scene in particular, he really knocks it out of the park. Everything from the quiver in his voice and the sadness in his eyes when he admits he attempted to kill Percy with the winged shoes, to his monologue immediately afterwards as his facade of a level-headed guy slowly slips away. Every aspect of it he nails perfectly, and Walker's acting during this scene is also very top-notch, but we'll talk more about him later. Quick side note, by the way, one thing I was confused about initially during the scene was Luke's sword Backbiter being able to create portals. At first I thought that was something that was made up for the show specifically, but apparently that is a thing in the books. It's not explored upon nearly that much, but apparently it was used in the book version of this scene, which just goes to show that I definitely should have reread The Lightning Thief before watching this show, but too late now. Though now that they fully acknowledge this ability of Backbiter, I am curious to see what they'll do with it in later seasons, since it seems to be that they're making a bigger deal about this ability than they were in the books. One thing about this scene that I am actually very unsure of was Annabeth's appearance during this scene. I don't know why she was just hanging around invisible watching the two of them, just plot convenience I suppose, but her reaction seemed slightly out of character. I think it was fine for the moment, but one thing that I hope they keep intact throughout the other seasons is Annabeth's relationship with Luke, which is something that I don't think they did a good job of really establishing at all. We hear Luke's side pretty clearly, but Annabeth in the books looked up to Luke greatly and considered him one of her closest friends, which becomes a running thing throughout the first 5 books, and in my opinion is a pretty key part of Annabeth's character development throughout those books. I understand that they had to focus on more immediately important aspects of the show for the sake of not dragging out the season, but in future seasons I hope they do dedicate some time to establishing their relationship from her side more, because I think that is a very important conflict for Annabeth throughout the books, and I hope that they do more with that. One thing I think they did a very good job of in terms of the writing, however, is developing Percy and Annabeth's relationship. The development of these two's relationship throughout the first 5 books is a pretty important factor in the series, and in my opinion is the backbone of the story in a lot of ways. So getting this right off the bat was pretty important in my opinion. And I'm happy to say that I think they did a pretty good job translating their early relationship into this format. They start off pretty antagonistic towards each other at the start of their quest, arguing constantly and whatnot, but after the fight with Medusa, they gain a better understanding of each other thanks to Grover calling them out for both being unreasonable. And after that, they both mellow out, and the show spends a pretty decent chunk of time establishing and growing their relationship, which I appreciated. They also made sure to sneak in their respective nicknames for each other in there, which I did also greatly appreciate. Though, on the downside of this, all of this establishing of Percy and Annabeth came at the cost of Grover as a whole, basically. I'll get into this more when I cover the individual characters and their castings later, but Grover and Percy's relationship feels very underdeveloped compared to what it's like in the book. They're established as good friends in the beginning, but once the quest actually starts, they barely spend any time together. Whenever they split up, it's usually Percy and Annabeth going together and Grover going on his own, with the exception of them in the underworld. And even then, they don't really get any level of deep relationship-defining moments like with Percy and Annabeth. I get that they're already established friends by the time the show starts, but throughout the book, I never really got the impression that they were bros like I did in the original books. And that seems like a good point to transition to the characters and their casting, so let's move on to that. I don't think anyone will argue with this when I say that the characters of Percy Jackson are the main appeal of the series. Everyone from Percy to Annabeth to Luke to Thalia, these characters are incredibly pivotal to the show's success, so it was very important that they got the characters right. Like a lot of hardcore fans of the series, I was also very disappointed with all of the race swapping that they did with a lot of the key characters. Not to the point where I'd go on Twitter to racially bully Annabeth's actress, who is a child, but I was pretty disappointed we weren't going to get a cast more in line with how all of the characters were designed in the books. Still though, I had faith in Rick and his team to put together a cast of actors that still felt like the characters I grew up with, and I'm happy to say that they mostly succeeded. Percy, I'd say, is one of the characters that was kept intact the most. In terms of his writing, he gets plenty of scenes to be his regular sassy and sarcastic self. He gets plenty of quips in every now and then, which is what we know him for. But he also gets plenty of scenes to be heroic and loyal towards his friends, which I think is another very big aspect of Percy's character that is important to highlight. Percy's literal fatal flaw is loyalty, caring so much about his friends and wanting to protect them that he'd literally throw the world away just to save one person he cares about. And that's highlighted here in many different ways, some very similar to the book and some different. The scene in Waterland with the golden chair is actually a pretty good example of this, even though I'm mixed on the scene as a whole. He displays his willingness to sacrifice his life to give his friends the opportunity to progress forward, even if it means giving up his chances to save his mom, which I think kind of flies in the face of how much he wanted to save his mom in the first place, but alright. Like I said, I have a lot of mixed feelings about the scene, but there were some scenes in other aspects of the series, like on the Ark, with Annabeth trying to sacrifice herself to give Percy and Grover time to get away, only for Percy to pull the bait and switch on her, and decides to fight the Chimera alone, even with his body poisoned. Once again, just showing his heroism and willingness to risk it all just to save those he considers friends. One last but incredibly important example is during Luke's betrayal and their final fight. During their final fight, Percy cuts Luke, and Percy immediately apologizes and moves in unguarded to check if Luke's okay, just for Luke to retaliate and cut Percy down. This is a very good example of the fact that Percy is loyal to a fault. Despite Luke having admitted doing the things he did and actively trying to kill Percy, Percy immediately softens up and apologizes after hurting someone he considers a friend. It's a very subtle inclusion, but one I greatly appreciated. And of course, Walker Scobell plays him incredibly well. I was mixed on his performances during the first 2 episodes, but he definitely got better as the show went on. Plus, he is a kid, so I'm willing to cut him some slack. I knew even before the rest of the casting was announced that Walker was going to be a great Percy. He has that same kind of wit and sarcasm that works super well with the character, and I thought he did a great job. He also was a big fan of the books before he was cast to play Percy, which is something I learned while researching this video, so that's cool. Annabeth was the character that I was worried about the most. Not necessarily because of the casting aspect. I think Leah Jeffries does a pretty good job of portraying the character that she was given to play, but I was worried about her from a writing perspective. In a world where Disney has become less known for their magical and wondrous animated films and more so for ham-fisting hollow, strong female leads into every production they make, I was incredibly worried that this version of Annabeth was going to fall into the same category of those kinds of characters that Disney's become known for. It would definitely be easy to as well, since Annabeth, especially at the beginning of the series, had a lot of the same qualities people associate with quote-unquote strong female characters that have plagued cinema for the last few years. But just focusing on that and not really addressing the subtle nuances that make her different and, actually a good character would be doing a huge disservice. and thankfully they handled her pretty well, I think. She starts out very cold and apathetic towards the beginning, but a lot of that drops after the Medusa episode and they start getting along a lot more. I'm not sure if I buy the whole greatest warrior in camp thing that Luke mentioned towards the beginning. I can buy her being the greatest tactician in camp, which is maybe what they meant by that line, but in terms of the actual best physical warrior, that was always Luke. Minor nitpick, but it felt worth mentioning, I think. Another small thing that I wasn't a fan of was the way Annabeth interacts with the different gods that they encounter. Annabeth throughout the books is shown to be very respectful and formal with the gods that they encounter, especially towards the beginning, because she knows how powerful they are and how if you speak out of line even so much as a little bit, they will smite you down without a second thought. But during their interactions with gods like Ares and Hermes, she continues to be very passive-aggressive and taunting of them, which doesn't strike me as something a cautious and tactical thinker like Annabeth would do, openly taunting and mocking the gods knowing that they can kill her at any time. This is why her and Percy's dynamic worked so well in the beginning. Annabeth thinks with her head while Percy thinks with his heart more often. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it was something that I noticed during the scenes with Ares and wanted to mention it because it really bothered me. Overall though, I didn't hate this version of Annabeth. Leia does a good job with what she was given, and I think they got the overall vibe of the character down pretty decently, even though there were some small things here and there that caused me to raise an eyebrow. Grover was probably the worst one out of the three when it came to a transition from the book character to the show. Again, Aryan Simhadri does a fine enough job with what he's been given, but in terms of the writing, he doesn't really give me the vibe of an anxious kid trying his best to help. He just kinda comes off as Percy and Annabeth's sidekick and rarely gets a chance to be his own character, and hardly gives off the vibe that he and Percy are best friends, like I said before. He gets one scene during the Medusa episode to scold Percy and Annabeth, which was a fine enough scene, but that hardly felt like a Grover thing to do. To be fair, Grover in the books doesn't do a whole lot of crazy stuff, at least compared to some of the other characters, but whenever he's there, he does contribute. He's not some useless sidekick that's just there to cheer everyone else on. He dropkicks Medusa during their fight with her, but they left that out of the show for some reason, even though it would have been really funny in a live action setting. He doesn't even get his main weapon in his reed pipes, which he has in like every book. Hopefully in future seasons where the Pan plotline becomes a bit more prevalent, we will get to see Grover come into his own more, because my boy does not deserve this. In terms of all the other side characters that make their appearance, a lot of them have pretty good casting, with my personal favorite being Adam Copeland as Ares. Every time he is on scene, he absolutely kills it. He has this vibe of having this very thin surface level of relaxed and carefree, with this level of anger and fury lying just beneath the surface. It's not 100% accurate with how he acts in the books, but I think this interpretation is really great anyways, and Adam knocks it out of the park, and has some really great lines throughout the whole thing. The rest of the cast is also pretty good. Glenn Turman gave off a really great elderly mentor vibe for Chiron, and I really enjoyed him whenever he was on screen. Dior Goodjohn as Clarice was good while she was on screen, albeit she wasn't around for super long. I already spoke my praises about Charlie Bushnell as Luke, he absolutely killed it. Lance Reddick as Zeus was absolutely phenomenal. I already knew he was a talented actor from the John Wick movies, but he does Zeus so much justice in just the one scene that he's in. And now I'm just sad we'll never get to see more of it due to his tragic passing in 2023. Lin-Manuel Miranda as Hermes was alright. The casting itself was fine and made sense, but he doesn't really get to flex a lot of his acting muscles in the one scene he's in. I know he's a talented actor, he was in Hamilton after all, but he doesn't really get a lot of chances to, like I said, flex his acting muscles. And those were really all the cast members I wanted to address. Not that the rest were bad, they just don't really have anything else worth mentioning besides the fact that the actors just did a good job. And I think that's about all I have to say about the Percy Jackson Disney Plus show. I'm gonna be completely honest. As this show approaches release, I was going into this with not super high expectations. With Disney's lack of quality control and lack of really everything that used to make it good, really, as well as the rapid decline of Disney Plus, I was expecting to come out of this at the other end thinking it was alright at best. But I ended up enjoying it way more than I ever thought I would. I still think it's far from perfect, and I think there's a lot of stuff that they could have done to improve the overall experience, and I can see why people wouldn't like it. But in terms of what it tried to do, I think it did a pretty decent job. Despite the controversial casting, I enjoyed them well enough and thought that they at least did a good job with the characters that they were given, And despite the series of events playing out differently, it was nice seeing all these iconic moments from the book recreated in live action. I do kind of wish that this show was animated rather than being live action, simply just because I think you could get a much better voice cast for specific characters, the action and fantasy powers would probably translate a lot better, and I just think the world of Percy Jackson translates a lot better to animation rather than a live action. But that's a personal preference thing, that's enough of me rambling about that. If I were to put a ranking to this, I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10. It's far from perfect, but I enjoyed it enough to say that I'm satisfied with the experience. And now, with a second season confirmed, we can only hope that they take the issues that this first season had and adjust them to make this second season even better. And from looking at Rick's statements on the prospect of a season 2, it seems like they're going in the right direction. Between this and the upcoming Kane Chronicled Netflix movies that are coming out in the future, which I just learned about, has this always been a thing? Was I just in the dark? When was this happening? It seems like the future is bright for Rordenverse adaptations. We just have to hope that they keep this momentum going and we could see a possible resurgence in the popularity of this franchise. And maybe we'll get a new wave of fans coming in from these new shows. Or all the shows are bad and everyone will check out the books because everyone will tell them that the books are better. We'll just have to see. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. This was a video I've been wanting to make ever since the first news about this show started to come out, regardless if it was going to be good or not. Anyways, that is about all from me, and I'll see you guys later.